Hello and welcome to this lecture of CL336 Advanced Transport Phenomena. Today we will begin discussing the basic principles, in particular starting with the continuum approach. So if we think about our general experiences with fluids, whether it's the water we drink or we use every day, the honey we spread on our toast, the air we feel blowing across our face and so on, all our general experience tends to convey the impression that fluids are continuous in the sense that they are indivisible, and the discrete nature of matter does not manifest itself at our scale of experience. Indeed, if we think about the thoughts going into the minds of the founders of continuum mechanics, most of whom lived around the 18th century, it's natural that they would also think about fluids as a continuum, that is an idealized material which is continuously divisible, at which there is no discrete nature at all. Now it's not that these founders didn't have doubts about, or rather, it's not that these founders truly believed that matter was indeed a continuum. In fact, a lot of them had thoughts about the atomistic nature of matter, and towards the 19th century, certainly, we knew a lot more about the atoms that form matter and so on. On the other hand, especially in the 18th century, they simply did not know enough about the microscopic nature of matter to even consider building a theory of how water flows in a pipe from a microscopic starting point. So therefore, their approach was to take it to be a continuum as a model, an idealization, and develop a theory based on that would ultimately try to predict observables such as the flow rate of fluid in a pipe, or the power required to stir a fluid and so on, and then judge the merit of their theory by comparing these observations with experiments. And this is indeed the idea behind the continuum approach that we adopt even today. But before we go on to discuss some more details about the continuum approach, let's first take a look at who these founders were. So of course, one cannot begin discussing a history of mechanics without starting with Newton. For the first time, let's say, initiated the program of trying and understanding nature in terms of basic laws or axioms. There were plenty of observations about planetary motion, even observations that had been mathematicized, as the examples of Kepler's 3 laws come to mind. Yet it was Newton who first felt that all of these observations should be explainable by a single set of laws that would be equally applicable to balls falling on the earth as well as the motion of planets. This sort of radical change of perspective from the people before him is what really sets Newton apart. However, we should bear in mind that Newton mainly solved problems to do with what we later call mass point mechanics. That is where an object is simply represented by a single point with an assigned mass. And so he, although the second book of his Principia did discuss fluids, he didn't really get any results that have survived, and his ideas on which these results were founded have mostly turned out to be incorrect. Nevertheless, the questions he attempted to raise, which include the drainage of water from a tank through a faucet, and the shape of the earth as a body of equilibrium balancing centrifugal and gravitational forces. These problems served as a fertile ground for researchers who came after him and who continued to advance mechanics. So after Newton, we had the Bernoullis, the family of great mathematical physicists and mathematicians. So you had Jacob and John, 2 brothers, and John's son, Daniel Bernoulli, after whom the famous Bernoulli equation for the energy of flow in a pipe that tells us how the kinetic energy of flow interconverts between gravitational potential energy and pressure. Anyway, so these Bernoullis made some advances on treating fluids, that is continuous matter, rather than just the single mass point mechanics of Newton. But yet they did get some isolated results, especially to do with beams and strings and hydrostatic fluids. But we didn't have a clear picture as yet. You also have D'Alembert, who made also some significant contributions. Particularly, he was the one who introduced the wave equation that for a string that we are all familiar with today. And now, building on the work of these masters, you had the giant in the field of continuum mechanics, Euler. So Euler studied under Bernoulli and certainly had access to all the past work of the Bernoullis, D'Alembert and Newton. But it was he who put it all together in a consistent framework and introduced some fundamental new ideas that allowed us to set continuum mechanics on a reasonably firm footing. For example, it was actually Euler who first wrote the equation that we now think of as Newton's second law, F equal to ma. Newton simply stated this in words, and the meaning of force was not so obvious, and how to apply his idea, his second law, so to speak, to a real system wasn't clear from Newton's work. But Euler gave a clear prescription of how to resolve forces in different directions and write down forces equal to mass times acceleration for any given system of mass point mechanics, as well as for macroscopic matter like a volume of fluid. However, he didn't go all the way because he was not able to clearly identify the meaning of surface forces or stresses. This had to await Cauchy, who was the first to write down what we today call the Cauchy stress principle, that tells us how portions of fluid exert surface forces on neighboring portions of fluid. And it was his fundamental idea which really brought together the works of his predecessors that gave us the foundations of continuum mechanics, both for fluids and for solids and their elastic behavior. But finally, coming down to the equations that would describe water, it required a further step to precisely specify what is the nature of these stresses, because Cauchy simply wrote down a stress principle in general, but one still had to relate the stress to the motion of the fluid within the continuum framework. And this is the so-called constitutive equation, of course, and that had to await further work, ultimately leading to Navier and Stokes to write down the famous Navier-Stokes equations independently, that we today work with and which forms the basis for the entire field of fluid mechanics. So a lot more on the history of mechanics is available in Truesdell's book, Essays in the History of Mechanics, and that's quite wonderful reading. Okay, so this is basically a brief amount of history, but the point here is to realize that it took a long time to write down these equations, a long time to go from Newton's mass point mechanics to the mechanics of continuous matter and fluids in particular. And the main reason behind this was difficulty with understanding how surface forces come into play, that is, how portions of fluid exert forces on neighboring portions through their surface. And the reason this is difficult is, of course, because of the continuum approximation itself. Because you see, the continuum, in some sense, as we shall see later, averages out or loses molecular information. So the continuum, because it has no picture of an underlying molecular structure, cannot account for molecular phenomena such as diffusion that leads to heat transport or transport of species, as well as intermolecular forces and intermolecular motion that transfers momentum that we think about as stress today. So it doesn't have a way to represent this naturally, and one needs to bring the concept of stress from outside, as it were. So this is what took a lot of work and a lot of thought, but ultimately it did all work out and give us the Navier-Stokes equations. Okay, so before we move on, let's now come back to our time and ask what is the position of the continuum approach in the present day. So of course, unlike in the 18th century, we have now a much clearer idea of the molecular constitution of matter. We understand for several, at least simple fluids, what is their molecular structure. We know the structure of the molecules. We can do molecular dynamic simulations with these molecules altogether. So one might ask, why not then try to describe the motion of fluids directly from this molecular basis? Why bother still with continuum mechanics and constitutive laws and constitutive equations? Sorry. One answer is to simply why don't look at this video first. Okay, so this is a molecular dynamics video prepared through a MD simulation available on YouTube. And what you see, this is the molecular vibrations of the molecules of water. These little blue lines that keep forming and disappearing are the forming and deforming of hydrogen bonds. The point here is you see that at the molecular scale, the molecules are in constant, what appears to be constant random motion. This is an extremely slowed down movie. As you can see, time is elapsing in picoseconds, which is 10 to the minus 12 of a second. And this simulation would have taken a lot of computational resources. If I speed this up to give you a more something that might be more instructive, so you see that the molecules are vibrating away happily, and all this intense activity and motion covered just about less than 2 picoseconds. So now you can imagine it would be an enormously complex task, a computationally intensive task, well beyond anything we can hope to simulate now or in the future, to try and simulate the macroscopic motion of water in a pipe from this molecular scale. So one basic problem with trying such a molecular program is purely computational. But there is more to it as well. You see, science is not, a good science rather, is not just about making predictions, but a good theory is one that gives you a lot more out of it than you put into it. So with this in mind, if you think about a molecular approach, there is just way too much of information at the molecular scale that goes in, and it's much more than the phenomena that we are interested in. In other words, if I want to simulate flow in a pipe from the molecular scale upwards, such a simulation would not only tell me if in principle, if such a simulation were somehow possible, it would tell me not only the velocity and the flow rate inside the pipe, which is what I may be interested in, but it would also be able to tell me the color of the fluid, the smell of the fluid, its chemical properties, and so on and so forth. All of which I am not interested in, let's say, for a particular study. But the very fact that it's able to do all this means it has tremendous amount of excess information, which also is basically why it's so computationally intensive. And it would also make the results extremely hard to understand. In other words, it would be a sort of black box in which will pop out some answers, but which would not really help us understand the phenomena that we might want to single out and understand. In this case, purely the flow of the material and not its color or smell and so on. And there's yet another way of thinking about the same issue and why it would be difficult, let's say, to identify macroscopic phenomena. So, for example, think about the flow of air, water and honey inside a pipe. So as you now know from your earlier introduction in fluid mechanics, that for such types of fluids, simple fluids, their motion is identical if their Reynolds number is the same. So in other words, if I have air flowing in a very small pipe, water flowing in a slightly larger one, and honey flowing in an even larger pipe, such that the ratios of the diameters are in accordance with the ratios of the viscosities of these fluids, then the motions would look entirely identical. And this can be directly identified from the continuum Navier-Stokes equations. And we understand from those equations why these fluids behave in the same way for suitably chosen pipe diameters. However, if you were to look at it microscopically, each of these fluids would have a completely different molecular structure, a completely different molecular simulation, and so they would appear like systems which have nothing in common at all. And this is a consequence of the additional information available at the microscale that I spoke about. So these are some reasons, other than the purely computational barrier, to why one would prefer to go with the continuum approach, and why in fact we still use the continuum approach and are likely to do for a long time to come. That it is not simply an issue of computation, it's also an issue of understanding the physics of interest in a given problem. Right, so if we accept now that the continuum approach is a useful and powerful approach to be taken alongside the microscopic approach when that approach may be warranted for smaller scale phenomena, it nevertheless still raises the question today of how does one reconcile these two ways of thinking about matter, because clearly they seem to be headed in completely different directions. The continuum model, continuum hypothesis or viewpoint indicates that matter is continuously divisible forever and remains smooth and continuous. On the other hand, the microscopic reality tells us that we have discrete molecules interacting, bouncing around, forming bonds with each other and so on, and that their motion is chaotic and random at the small scale, whereas at the continuum scale the fluid might be still or progressing smoothly. So there are a couple of ways of thinking about this. The first is to think about the continuum. Let's take for example the continuum velocity the velocity field that we would try to measure try to predict from the continuum model, that this velocity field represents a suitable phase average of the molecular scale velocities. So how do we see this? Yeah, so let's take a moment here to just think about a simple picture. So imagine you have some volume of fluid where you have a bunch of molecules bouncing around apparently randomly. Now, within this small region, at any point in space, the molecules, if you were to look at a time series of these molecular motions, they would be quite random. So a natural way, and the way that we have used to think about such molecular velocities is through probability distributions. So one could think about asking not what is exactly the velocity at a certain time in space, but rather what is the probability distribution, the PDF of the velocity at a certain position, and you get something like this. The details aren't important, but the point is that there is some average that you would experience, and then there'll be some spread of velocities and so on. This is of course the molecular velocity, right? So the idea is here that if one defines a suitable average of the PDF, then this could be the continuum velocity. So the velocity continuum is some sort of average involving this PDF of the molecular velocities, or some suitable phase average which takes into account this PDF. So the study of the PDF is what statistical mechanics is involved with, and if you take suitable phase averages or ensemble averages, then those average quantities have been shown to exactly satisfy the continuum field equations. This was done by Knoll in the paper in 1955, building on earlier work. So this is one way in which we can put the continuum viewpoint in correspondence with the statistical mechanics viewpoint, which is molecular in nature. What should be kept in mind here, of course, is that this statement about the equivalence holds only for the general conservation laws, that is the conservation of mass, energy and momentum. Those will be exactly the same for the continuum descriptions as well as for averages from StatMech. However, what will not clearly be the same is the constitutive equation. So that ultimately remains something that we cannot derive from first principles in most fluids, and that's why the final equations in which the constitutive equation has been inserted will not match statistical mechanics description in general. But the basic statement of mass conservation in terms of the mean density, the suitably average velocity and so on will have the same form in continuum and from StatMech. So this is one way to think about things. But there is another way to think about it as well, which we'll come to in a moment. Let me just erase these molecules and let them continue on their vibrations. Yes, so what's the other way? Well, the other way is to simply think of it probably the way that the founders did. That is that the continuum viewpoint is an idealization, and it serves as a phenomenological model, which means that we try to model a phenomena that emerges at the scale of interest, which is our regular scale of daily life, on the order of meters, centimeters, even down to micrometers in the case of some fluids. So at that scale, the phenomena we observe does appear to be describable by a continuum. And so this is what we do. We develop, we start with the continuum approximation, we develop a theory, and then we make predictions of certain observables which can be compared with experiment. And so the accuracy or the validity of the continuum viewpoint for a given fluid and a given flow will ultimately be determined by the accuracy of the predictions you make. Now here it's important to draw a distinction. What I'm saying is not that the continuum approximation can be directly validated with the experiment, because the very ideas behind the continuum viewpoint or underlying the continuum viewpoint are entirely abstract. There is no real velocity field that is smooth and differentiable in actual space, because if we actually take a probe that gets smaller and smaller, we will encounter random molecular fluctuations. And we can't really measure these molecules at a given time and do an ensemble average and then compare it to the continuum velocity, which we really cannot measure because it is an idealization. Rather, we have to develop the continuum viewpoint as a set of abstract ideas, and what we can compare with the experiment are the final predictions of observables like the flow rate, like the pressure drop, and so on. So in this sense, continuum mechanics is not a merely empirical science. By that I mean the ideas, the theorems behind continuum mechanics were not developed based on experiment at all. So especially when we later come to constitutive equations and we talk about what's known as the Newton's law of viscosity for Newtonian fluids. Especially in undergraduate studies, one is conveyed the information or the impression that this is an empirical fact based on experiment. But that's not true. Although it has been validated with experiments after the fact, the theory and the equation proposed actually came out of theoretical ideas based on mathematical thinking, as well as close correspondence with general experience of the nature of fluids. And what this exactly means, we will see as we review the basic principles and the underlying equations. And one way to summarize this, a very crisp, succinct way, as Truesdell and Turpin said, experience has been the guide, thought has been the creator. In this case, mathematical thought. And so that's what we shall see as we go along looking at these equations.